Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to get you genuinely well-informed, fast. Today, I want you to think about what really powers life on Earth, like really powers it. We always jump to sunshine, water, but there's this hidden world underneath it all. Inside plants, we're talking about the actual chemical elements, the tiny building blocks that keep plants going. So, our mission today, a deep dive into plant nutrition and soils. We're using a chapter from the classic Raven Biology of Plants as our guide. Think of this as your shortcut to understanding what plants need, how they get it, the cycles that keep it all going, and even how we humans are kind of changing the game. We'll break it down, make it accessible. You should walk away feeling pretty well informed, maybe even have a few aha moments. No diagrams needed, we promise.
It's so true. Light and water get all the glory, but the nutrient side is, well, it's fundamental. And plants are incredibly efficient. Unlike us animals, most green plants, they basically make their own food, right? Photosynthesis turns CO2 and water into sugars. But then, they pull up these simple inorganic bits from the soil, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and build everything else they need. Amino acids, vitamins, the works.
Okay, so plant nutrition isn't just like plant food, it's a whole process.
Exactly. It's the whole journey, getting the raw materials in, moving them around the plant, and then actually using them for growth, for metabolism. It's the complete system.
It seems obvious now, but figuring out which elements were essential, that took time, didn't it? What was the key moment?
Oh, absolutely. For ages, people debated if elements found in plants were essential or just, contamination. The big game changer, really, was hydroponics. This started becoming clear around the mid-1800s, growing plants in water solutions without any soil where they could precisely control the elements present.
Ah, so they could leave one out and see what happened.
Precisely. And they found that if certain elements were missing, the plant showed really specific problems, deficiency symptoms, and often could even make seeds.
Yeah.
That proved about 10 elements were absolutely crucial right off the bat.
10 to start with. But the list grew. How many are we talking about now?
Yeah, it expanded over the next century or so.
Okay.
Discoveries kept coming: manganese, zinc, copper, boron, molybdenum, even nickel relatively recently in the 80s. So today, the standard list for most vascular plants is 17 essential elements.
17. Okay. And what makes something officially essential? There have to be rules for that.
Definitely. There are two main criteria. First, the plant absolutely needs it to complete its life cycle. Like, it has to be able to produce viable seeds. Second, the element has to be part of some essential molecule or structure in the plant. Think magnesium is right at the heart of the chlorophyll molecule, the green stuff for photosynthesis. Or nitrogen, it's in every single protein, every DNA molecule. If it's not there, key things just can't be built or function.
Right. And you see problems if it's missing. Makes sense. And presumably, plants don't need giant amounts of all 17. That leads to macro versus micronutrients.
Exactly. Scientists figure out the amounts needed by, well, basically analyzing healthy plants. They dry them out completely, get the dry weight, and measure how much of each element is there. Macronutrients are the ones needed in larger quantities, over 1,000 milligrams per kilogram of dry weight. Think nitrogen, potassium, calcium, phosphorus. There are 9 of them. Micronutrients, or trace elements, are just as vital, but needed in tiny amounts, less than 100 milligrams per kilogram. Iron, zinc, copper, boron, the other 8.
So even a tiny trace of something like molybdenum can be absolutely critical.
Absolutely. And accumulating these, especially against the concentration gradient from the soil, actually costs the plant energy. They're actively pumping these ions in.
That's fascinating. And then there are these other elements, not on the main list of 17, but still helpful for some plants, beneficial elements.
Yes, exactly. Some plants have adapted to use elements that aren't universally essential, like silicon. It's crucial for horsetails and grasses. It strengthens their cell walls, makes them more rigid, almost like adding structural support, and helps ward off pests. Or aluminum, toxic in high doses for most, but tea plants seem to benefit from it, maybe boosting antioxidants. Sodium is essential for plants adapted to salty conditions. It shows how diverse plant strategies can be.
Okay, so we know what they need. Let's dig into why. What are these elements actually doing inside the plant?
Oh, they have tons of different jobs. Some are structural components, like we said, nitrogen and proteins, magnesium and chlorophyll. Others are like keys for enzymes, helping chemical reactions happen faster. Magnesium is actually a cofactor for a lot of enzymes, and some play regulatory roles. Calcium, for example, acts like a messenger, helping control things like the opening and closing of stomata, those little pores on leaves.
And when a plant doesn't get enough, it shows signs. Deficiency symptoms, what does that usually look like?
You usually see it most clearly in the shoots, the leaves and stems. Common signs are Well, stunted growth is a big one. Also necrosis, which is basically patches of dead tissue like brown spots. And chlorosis, that's the yellowing of leaves because they aren't making enough chlorophyll.
And here's the really neat part. I remember where the yellowing shows up tells you something, right? About how the element moves.
That's a fantastic diagnostic tool. It depends on the element's mobility, how easily the plant can move it around, usually in the phloem, from older parts to younger, growing parts. Take magnesium. It's mobile. So if magnesium is scarce, the plant will pull it from the older leaves and send it to the new leaves. So the older leaves turn yellow first.
Okay, sacrificing the old for the new.
Right. But then take iron. Iron is pretty much immobile in the phloem. It stays put once it's in a leaf. So if there's an iron shortage, the new young leaves won't get enough, and they'll show chlorosis first, while the older leaves might stay green. Seeing yellowing young leaves often points towards iron deficiency.
That's a really useful clue. Okay, so where do these elements come from? We've hinted at it, but let's talk soil. It's obviously way more than just dirt.
Oh, absolutely. Soil is the main stage for plant nutrition. It provides physical support, sure, but it's also the reservoir for inorganic nutrients, it holds water, and it provides the airspace roots need to breathe. It's a complex, living system.
How does soil even form in the first place? It starts from rock, right?
It does. It's a super slow process called weathering. Physical weathering is things like freezing and thawing, wind, water, glaciers grinding down rocks into smaller bits. Then there's chemical weathering, where water and acids dissolve minerals, and then life gets involved. Bacteria, fungi, lichens start growing on the wetted rock. Plants eventually move in. As all these things die and decompose, they add organic matter. Think of prairie grasses with those dense, fibrous roots. They build incredible topsoil over time.
And if you were to dig down, you'd see distinct layers, like a cake, the horizons.
It's exactly like a layer cake. The A horizon, the topsoil, is the richest layer. It's dark, full of organic matter, that lovely humus plus roots, worms, microbes. It's the most active zone. Aristotle wasn't wrong calling earthworms intestines of the earth. Their castings really enrich it.
And below that?
Below the A is the B horizon, or subsoil. It tends to be denser, less organic. It's where minerals like iron oxides and clays washed down from the topsoil accumulate. And beneath that is the C horizon, which is basically weathered parent rock material, the stuff the soil originally formed from.
It's not just solid stuff either. Half of soil is actually empty space.
Roughly, yeah. About 50% of a good soil's volume is pore space. And that space is filled with a constantly changing mix of air and water, both absolutely critical for roots. The solid part is made of particles of different sizes: sand, silt, and clay. Clay particles are incredibly tiny, less than 2 micrometers across.
And the mix of those particle sizes gives you different soil types.
Right. Sandy soils, silty soils, clay soils. The ideal mix for agriculture is often loam.
Why loam?
Loam has a good balance. Enough sand for drainage so roots don't drown, but enough silt, and especially clay, to hold on to water, and, crucially, nutrients.
Ah, holding nutrients. How does soil do that? Why don't they just wash away?
That's where the tiny clay particles and humus really shine. They have negatively charged surfaces. Many essential nutrients like calcium, potassium, magnesium exist in the soil water as positively charged ion cations. These positive cations are attracted to the negative surfaces of the clay and humus, kind of like static cling. This holds them in the soil, preventing them from being easily leached out by rain.
So they're stuck there. How do plants get them?
Through agitation exchange. Roots release hydrogen ions, H+, partly from respiration creating carbonic acid. These H+ ions can basically knock the nutrient cations off the clay particles into the soil water where the roots can then absorb them. It's a constant swap happening.
Clever. What about negatively charged nutrients like nitrate?
They're trickier. Because they're anions, negatively charged, they aren't held by the negative clay particles. So things like nitrate and sulfate can leach out of the soil much more easily, especially with heavy rain or irrigation. Phosphate is a bit of an exception. It can get locked up with other minerals.
Okay, let's zoom out. All these elements, they cycle through the planet, right? Earth is a closed system, mostly.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Elements move through biogeochemical cycles from the non-living environment, rocks, water, air, into living organisms and back again. But the cycles aren't perfect. They're a bit leaky. Nutrients get lost to erosion. Sometimes they're removed when we harvest crops, or they leach away.
Let's tackle the big one, the nitrogen cycle. You said nitrogen gas is abundant in the air, 78%, but plants can't use it directly.
It's a major paradox. N2 gas is incredibly stable, hard to break apart. Plants need nitrogen in fixed forms, like ammonium, NH4+, or nitrate, NO3. And despite the vast atmospheric reservoir, the availability of fixed nitrogen in the soil is very often the thing that limits how much plants can grow.
So how does that atmospheric N2 get turned into usable forms? What are the steps?
Well, first, organic nitrogen in dead stuff gets broken down by decomposers back into ammonium. That's ammonification. Then other soil bacteria perform nitrification, converting ammonium first to nitrite and then to nitrate. Most crop plants prefer to take up nitrate. Finally, plants absorb that nitrate or ammonium and assimilate it, building it into amino acids, proteins, DNA, everything they need.
But that doesn't add new nitrogen from the air. How does that happen?
That critical step is nitrogen fixation. This is converting N2 gas from the atmosphere into ammonium. It's done almost entirely by certain types of bacteria using an enzyme called nitrogenase. It's incredibly energy intensive for the bacteria.
And the most famous nitrogen fixers are the ones that partner with legumes.
Absolutely. The symbiosis between rhizobia bacteria and legumes, plants like peas, beans, clover, alfalfa, is responsible for a huge amount of the planet's fixed nitrogen. The bacteria live inside special structures on the roots called nodules.
Nodules, right. Can you briefly explain how they form? It sounds complex.
It is. It's like a chemical conversation. The root sends out signals, flavonoids, that attract the right bacteria. The bacteria respond with their own signals, called nod factors. This makes the root hair curl around the bacteria, and an infection thread forms, kind of like a tunnel, guiding the bacteria into the root cells. Once inside, they're enclosed in a membrane, forming structures called symbiosomes, and the plant cells divide rapidly to form the visible nodule. It's an amazing coordinated process.
Wow. And inside that nodule, there's that oxygen problem you mentioned earlier. Nitrogenase, the fixed enzyme, hates oxygen, but the bacteria need oxygen.
Exactly, the oxygen paradox. The solution is lehemoglobin. It's a pinkish protein similar to hemoglobin in our blood, made by both the plant and the bacteria. It binds oxygen and carefully delivers just enough for the bacteria's respiration while keeping the concentration low enough that it doesn't inhibit the nitrogenase enzyme. Really elegant.
Nature's solutions are amazing. But humans have figured out industrial nitrogen fixation too.
Yes, the Haber-Bosch process, developed just before World War I. It combines nitrogen and hydrogen gas under high temperature and pressure to make ammonia, mostly for fertilizer. It now fixes roughly as much nitrogen annually as all natural biological processes combined. Hugely important for feeding the world, but it uses a lot of fossil fuel energy.
Okay, let's switch gears to phosphorus. Needed in smaller amounts, but often the most limiting nutrient. Why is that?
Mostly because its main reservoir is rock. It's released very slowly through weathering. There's no significant atmospheric component like with nitrogen. Plus, phosphate, the form plants absorb, tends to be really immobile in soil and can get locked up chemically, making it unavailable even if it's technically there.
So plants need special strategies to get enough phosphorus too.
They do. One common strategy is teaming up with mycorrhizal fungi. These fungi create a massive network of hyphae, thread-like structures extending far beyond the root, effectively increasing the root system's surface area for nutrient absorption, especially phosphorus. Some plants, like certain members of the Protea family or lupines, develop cluster roots. These look like little bottle brushes, and they release bursts of organic acids, like citrate and malate.
What do the acids do?
They help dissolve phosphorus that's bound to soil minerals like calcium or iron, releasing it so the plant can take it up. It's like the plant is actively mining the soil.
So these cycles are crucial, but human activities are messing with them.
Significantly. Agriculture, industry, wastewater, we're altering the flows. With phosphorus, we accelerate its loss from land through erosion and crop removal, and then excess phosphorus running off fields or from sewage into lakes and rivers causes eutrophication, those big algal blooms that deplete oxygen and harm aquatic life.
And with nitrogen, fertilizer is the big one.
Fertilizer use adds a huge amount of reactive nitrogen to the environment, often more than ecosystems can handle. This leads to nitrate pollution of groundwater, which is a health risk if it gets into drinking water. We're also destroying natural wetlands, which are key sites where bacteria convert nitrate back into harmless N2 gas, a process called denitrification. So we're adding more and reducing the natural removal process.
It sounds like we need smarter ways to manage nutrients. What's happening in research and agriculture?
A lot. A key part is better soil management. Agriculture inherently removes nutrients when crops are harvested.
So testing and fertilizing become essential.
Right. Soil tests can pinpoint specific deficiencies. Then farmers can apply fertilizers more precisely. You often see NPK ratios on fertilizer bags, like 10-5-5, showing the percentage of nitrogen, phosphate, P2O5, and potash, K2O. And composting is making a big comeback. It's a great way to recycle organic waste. improve soil structure and water retention, and provide a slow release of nutrients. It reduces waste and the need for synthetic fertilizers.
Beyond managing what we have, can we make plants themselves more efficient or resilient?
That's a huge area of research. Plant breeding and biotechnology are developing crops better adapted to difficult soils low in nutrients or high in toxic elements like aluminum, which is a big problem in acidic tropical soils.
You mentioned aluminum toxicity. How do plants fight that?
Some resistant plants pump out organic acids like malate or citrate from their root tips. These acids bind to the toxic aluminum ions in the soil, basically neutralizing them before they can damage the root. Researchers are trying to enhance this ability in crops like rice and wheat.
And what about using plants for cleanup, phytoremediation?
Yeah, that's really cool. Some plants, called hyperaccumulators, can absorb incredibly high levels of heavy metals like cadmium, nickel, or arsenic from contaminated soil. They store these metals in their shoots and leaves, often in places where they do the least harm, like the leaf surface. You can then harvest the plants, removing the contaminants in the soil. It's like using plants as natural vacuum cleaners for pollution.
That's incredible. And finally, can we boost nitrogen fixation?
That's kind of the holy grail. One approach is improving the existing legume-rhizobia symbiosis, finding more efficient bacterial strains or plant varieties. Another is trying to establish effective nitrogen-fixing partnerships with non-legume crops, like cereals. Getting bacteria to live inside or closely associate with rice or wheat roots and provide them with nitrogen could be revolutionary. And the ultimate long-term goal is genetic engineering, maybe even transferring the nitrogen-fixing genes, SNF genes, directly into crop plants themselves, enabling them to make their own nitrogen fertilizer from the air.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot. From the specific elements plants need to how they get them from complex soils, the huge importance of nutrient cycles like nitrogen and phosphorus, the ways humans impact these cycles, and some really innovative future solutions. It really drives home how connected plants are to everything, the soil, the atmosphere, the microbes. It's not just about sun and water. So as you go about your day, maybe look at a tree or the food on your plate and think about that hidden world of nutrients. What new questions pop up for you about this balance, about nature's resilience, and maybe our own role in keeping these essential cycles healthy for the future? How does knowing this change your view on food security or environmental health?
It definitely makes you appreciate the complexity, doesn't it? And how much we still have to learn to work with these natural systems rather than just disrupting them.
Exactly. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of plant nutrition and soils. We hope you feel more well-informed, maybe a little inspired. From all of us here at The Deep Dive, thanks for listening.